Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another installment of Fixing the Forgotten, where we discuss underperforming lords, heroes, and units for the various factions of Total War Warhammer 2, and what can be done to improve them stat-wise or cost-wise, to make them a bit more viable, or what could be tweaked about them to make them a bit more viable in the multiplayer meta, and just make them a bit more enjoyable to use, and perhaps solving certain faction issues. As usual, we're going to be discussing everything from lords to heroes to regiments of renown and regular units. The only exception is going to be that we're leaving out cross-faction units. Those will be getting their own video, hopefully at a later point. So things like giants, chaos spawn, hounds. I don't really want to touch on them in a single faction video because I don't want to be repeating the same stuff over and over. But those will hopefully get their own day in the sun in the future. This time around, we are going to be discussing the Beastmen, who are another bit of low-hanging fruit after the Greenskins, a faction that's definitely riddled with some serious weaknesses and downsides, and does have a few sort of underpowered units, and I think it's worth discussing them, and discussing what could be done to make them a bit better. So without further ado, let's kind of kick things off with our lords, and first and foremost, I'm sure nobody's really surprised to see him here, is Khazrak One-Eye. Now I do think Khazrak is a little bit unfairly maligned. I don't think he's actually that bad of a lord in most ways, but he does have a few tangible disadvantages that make him a bit less appealing to use. Now stat-wise, he's definitely decent. He's basically a somewhat better version of a beast lord. If you compare his stats, you can see, yeah, he's got a bit more melee defense, more armor, HP, weapon strength, all that. He's just across the board a better beast lord. That said, Khazrak does have one major issue. Now, granted, he does have Vanguard, which makes him nice to synergize with Vanguard builds, but one of his big problems is that he doesn't have great utility items. In comparison, a Beast Lord has the Horde of the First Beast, which is basically a mini Wa that covers a decent-sized area around him. 55 meters is no small laughing matter. It's really pretty potent. Plus 8 leadership, also very good. On top of that, he gets Apocalyptic Vision, which is an extra, like, double whammy of extra melee attack that you can land on your troops. So this is a very potent sort of back-to-back buff you can cast. Khazrak doesn't have that. He does have Apocalyptic Visions, but that's the weaker of the two options. You can see there it's only lasts 18 seconds and has much AoE. Besides that, his items are very expensive. Both Scourge as well as Darkmail are incredibly pricey, and they only affect Khazrak. The Scourge, it's not a bad item. It lasts for 40 seconds, gives him poison and monsters melee stats, but it does cost over 200 gold. Deadly Onslaught's certainly not bad, and this is where Khazrak should shine. He's definitely a bit better of a combat lord than a beast lord. But simply put, on a chariot, because you just want that utility more than you want the damage output. A lot of these stats just don't matter too much when you're just plowing over enemies on a chariot. Finally, the Darkmail is an item that's been kind of garbage for ages. It's been buffed. Now it's active in melee. It's 22% magic resist, 24 armor. Definitely not terrible in melee, but for an item that costs 200 gold, or over 200 gold, that's very pricey. For what's not that good of a buff. Keep in mind that with the 110 armor, most non-AP stuff isn't doing very much to Khazrak to begin with. It's just not really that much of a threat. And the magic resistance, which would be great for lord sniping and whatnot, when you're on a chariot, you're kind of just running back and forth through enemies. You're often not actually engaged in melee because you're cycle charging all the time. And so in those periods, you're still vulnerable to magic damage. And I just find that to be a little unfortunate. I think that if Darkmail was at least made permanent, it would give Khazrak a decent sort of role as a somewhat tanky lord. The problem is that on foot right now, Khazrak is just generally outshone by Morgur, who we don't have here, but Morgur is almost invulnerable to ranged fire because he's got 75% missile resist. Morgur has some built-in magic resist. He has regen, he has poison, which reduces enemy damage coming in, and he's got higher HP than Khazrak. His melee stats are largely comparable except for armor. And so all in all, Morgur's just a lot tankier, and he brings more utility because he does have those 2 charges of Chaos Spawn. And if you want to go on a chariot, once again, you get more utility out of Beast Lord. So I think what Khazrak should definitely get is, he should have the Darkmail, in my opinion, buffed to be just permanent passive buff. I don't think it should have a requirement. And I do think there should be some consideration made to perhaps give Khazrak a little more utility. Obviously, the Horn of the First Beast is already on the Beast Lord. But even if it was something like stand your ground just to keep your troops in the fight, perhaps just some better leadership or something, that would be good. Otherwise, definitely, I'd say drop the cost of both Scourge and Darkmail. Make him a bit more of a tanky lord. If he was like a hybrid between a supporting fighty lord and a bit of a tank, I think that would make him much more viable, rather than simply making him this lackluster combatant that he's now. Next up on the list, and the only other lord I really think worth mentioning, is Maligore. And I don't think Maligore is necessarily in a bad spot, but he's definitely fallen off. One of the big problems for him is that he's very flimsy. He's got almost no armor. Very poor leadership, relatively low mobility compared to Kazrak, who's got 42 base speed. He's only got 38, and that's despite the fact that he's wings, which I think is a bit ridiculous. His melee stats are not particularly impressive. They're decent for caster, but not amazing. And he's got kind of an identity crisis. Now, before he was almost mandatory to get your Sigor spam going, Savage Dominion. The problem is that now that's a lot less, because Sigor spams or Sigor summons are so cheap. I think it's much better to just bring a normal shaman on a chariot, because he's going to be more survivable in general than Maligore is, and you're not really going to be struggling for Winds of Magic to get Savage Dominion off twice, because it's only 15 a cast now. You're not really looking to do those artillery builds anymore as much, because the Sigor just doesn't last long enough. So I think that Maligore really needs something else to make it viable, and he's got a bit of an identity crisis, because icons of vilifications and the something wicked this way comes are short-ranged AoE abilities. They should be buffing your friendly leadership, which is great for Beastmen. They should be debuffing enemy leadership, which is also very cool. The problem is that Maligore's too squishy to really make use of this. He can't really stay in combat. He can't even really risk being too close to combat. It makes these items practically useless. If you're going to run Maligore, you're basically just going to run him as a cheap caster. To free up more money for a bigger army. You're not going to bother with his items, really, because they just don't come into play enough. How to buff that? I think Maligore just could be a little bit tankier, much like Kazrak could be a smidge tankier, I think Maligore could use a little bit more tankiness. Maybe swapping out his melee attack for his melee defense, making him more defensive rather than offensive. Perhaps giving him some sort of save against magic damage. That could also help. He is, after all, a pretty potent caster, so it could sort of be reflected that he can defend himself against magic at least a little bit. And obviously, in a faction that has no heals, it's pretty important to have some level of survivability if you want to make a lord viable, especially in short-ranged engagements, which you need to use icons of vilification. But that's just my 2 cents there. It's definitely something I think is lacking with Maligore. And I think that if you buff the survivability, it could become a much more better niche pick against units or factions like Vampire Counts or Coast or even Tomb Kings, factions where you're dealing with a lot of fear and terror and leadership debuffs. Next up, we do have the Gorbel, which I think is a slightly underpowered unit. I don't think it's in that dire of a situation. The one thing that I find is really annoying with the Gorbel. Now, granted, the melee stats, melee attack and defense, not the greatest, but he hits like a truck, 420 weapon strength, 30 bonus versus large, very solid, 100 armor, 4400 HP, all very good. And the mass buffs have made him more resilient to getting ping-ponged around. The problem is that his items are very expensive. Axe of Men, for example, is, I do believe, 200 gold. Deadly Onslaught and Foe Seeker are very expensive. Or Foe Seeker isn't, but Deadly Onslaught is. Slaughterer's Call, which is a very good item, and one of the main reasons, in my opinion, to bring a Gorbel. It's very good, but also 200 gold. Banner of the Fallen Kings just isn't that strong. It's 10% more damage, which is nice. That's another 40 damage, I guess, or 42 damage to be exact. But ultimately, when you're above or when you're below 50% HP, but ultimately the Gorbel is very expensive, and it's one of the big downsides to it, I think, is the leadership actually. Now, granted, you do get immunity psychology from Bloodgreed, which is nice, but 60 leadership is bad. It's on par with Empire State Troops. It's just not impressive. And if you're losing combat and you're getting surrounded, it makes it so you can rout relatively easily. And it's a problem that extends to Minotaurs as well. And I think one of the big problems right now for Beastmen is that they really lack good anchor tools. Now, granted, you do get the Encourage aura out of this bad boy. You do get the Slaughterer's Skull, which I just mentioned. But I think that the Gorbels could use a little bit more leadership just to help them stay in the fight longer, help them support their troops a little bit longer. An extra 5 leadership, I think, would go a long way just to make these guys a little better. I wouldn't say anything too excessive. Like, I think plus 10 even would be acceptable, but I think at least plus 5 should be done. They are, after all, a beefy, very angry sort of giant Minotaur here. I don't see a reason why they couldn't be buffed that way. And I think it would make them a little bit more of a good pick, because you wouldn't be so worried about them getting routed so quickly. Otherwise, a little bit more HP maybe just to make them a smidge tankier, because I don't think their melee stats should necessarily be buffed. But really, the main concern, I think, is that low leadership. Now, next up is Minotaurs, because we just talked about Gorbels, and I kind of want to talk about Minotaurs here. Minotaurs do have 3 variants, and as you can see here, I actually do have the Minotaurs with shields on the field. I don't think Minotaurs with shields are underpowered at all. I actually think they're in a very good spot. I do think vanilla Minotaurs and Minotaurs with great weapons, though, are not worthwhile. So granted, Minotaurs with great weapons, they've got some amazing melee stats. 28 bonus for large is pretty monstrous. Increases their damage by basically a quarter, by 25% against large, and it boosts their melee attack to 64, which is pretty insane. So on paper, these guys should be very good. The problem is that both vanilla Minotaurs and Minotaurs with great weapons don't have shields, and they have bad armor. So compared to Minotaurs with shields, yeah, sure, you've got these benefits in melee, and Minotaurs with dual wielding actually got buffed in the last patch, so they now have more charge bonus and more melee attack. The problem is that these units are still pretty expensive. They're not much cheaper in the case of normal Minotaurs, and they're actually more expensive in the case of great weapons, and you get stupidly susceptible to low AP shooting. Anything from Goblin Archers, Wolf Riders, Pistoliers will tear you a new one. And on top of that, because your melee defense drops by 14 from 46 to 32, it makes you much more susceptible to non-AP melee units. So spearmen are a huge threat to you. Heavy cavalry that's non-AP, like honestly, for example, Reiksguard or Knights of the Blazing Sun will leave a huge dent in great Minotaurs with great weapons and Minotaurs, and you'll often see me in my replays just charging these units head on because I know I'm going to do enough damage to just crack them. And I think that this should be, and I think that this should be adjusted for with cost. I think Minotaurs with great weapons are simply still overpriced. I think they should very most cost the same as Minotaurs with shields. I definitely don't think they should be costing 100 gold more. They just are not worth it because that loss in survivability is huge, and it is incredibly painful to suffer that sort of loss on a unit that you need to stick around. And the simple fact is that against large, you're better off bringing Minotaurs with shields and then bring a Lore of Shadows caster to just debuff your opponent's melee defense to make them a little bit better against large, if that's really your problem. Otherwise, except against factions that have no shooting, like Vampire Counts, or maybe factions with very limited shooting. I'm trying to think what faction with like limited shooting you really consider them against, though, and nothing really comes to mind. Maybe Norska, you could risk it because Norska's not likely. You could shut down the Norskan backline relatively easily, but by and large, the unshielded Minotaurs just aren't worth it in my opinion. They're just too easy to destroy. The second thing I wanted to mention, and this is part of the reason why I brought the Minotaurs with shields in here, is I think once again Minotaurs could use a leadership buff. 60 leadership, as I mentioned before, is very low. Makes the Minotaurs very susceptible to routing. Obviously, they do have that immune psychology built in, which is important to keep in mind as long as Blood Greed is active. And then this does boost their leadership quite a bit, but I do think they're still a little bit susceptible to routing. A little too. The Beastmen need an anchor unit, and I think that's kind of the key here. Both of the Gorbel as well as the Minotaurs. Yeah, you got base 60, and he goes up to 72 with Blood Greed. The problem is they're still very susceptible to routing in my experience. You get surrounded, you take a lot of damage because you've got very low armor, and it becomes a little bit of a problem for Beastmen, especially in matches against factions that can easily tear or fear out the rest of your army. I think a little bit more leadership could help the Minotaurs. Maybe like a +2 or 3 would be a nice tweak upwards, just to make them a little bit more sustainable in the field. Next up, the Sons of Goros unit. I should mention that as far as cost decreases, I think Minotaurs should go down, or could go down by another 50 or so gold. And I think Minotaurs with great weapons should definitely go down by 100. Going down by to the Sons of Goros, this unit is simply overpriced and has some questionable abilities. They pay for Guardian, which is not a bad ability, except it doesn't really work with Beastmen. Fact of the matter is, Beastmen don't have a Cavalry Lord. Their fastest lords are mounted on chariots, which is still significantly fast. So keep in mind that when you start a match, so if we start right now, your speed goes up to 95. All your Centaurs in this game are 95 speed. Because most of the game, because they do have Primal Fury. So because of that, I think the Guardian is just not valuable. You can't. These guys are not a static unit that you want sitting on the backline defending against harass on someone like Morgur or Maligore. And they're not a unit you're going to be using to escort Kazrak or something, because they can't push through with him. They're not a chariot unit, so they're not going to be able to plow through enemy infantry with him. And they're not going to be, and Kazrak's not going to be supporting you in wide sweeping flank maneuvers most of the time. So you're basically paying for an ability you get little to no value out of, which is really, really annoying. And on top of that, that's basically their only ability. Their only other benefit is the fact they've got 70 armor, so they've got 35 more than normal Centaurs. It's nice. And then magic attacks, which is kind of critical on the Beastmen roster, which has very little access to magic otherwise. The problem is you're paying 300 more gold for these guys than you do for normal Centaurs with great weapons, which is a bit excessive. In a lot of cases, you just don't care about that armor that much. The magic attacks are often just useless, besides like Undead. But Undead are already a nightmare match anyway, so it barely helps. And yeah, the Guardian just literally doesn't come into play. So I think these guys should honestly lose Guardian and drop in price by like 100 or 150 gold. That would make them much more appealing, because then you're paying 150 gold for better stats, magic, and armor, instead of paying 300 gold over the base variant for Guardian, magic damage, and 35 armor. And Guardian's just so useless. Next up, Ungor Raiders, unit that's I think gets kind of overlooked. These guys are fairly cheap, 425 gold, I do believe, but their stats are just very poor. Only 1 AP damage. Granted, there is 90 models, so do keep that in mind, but only one point of AP, which is definitely a huge weakness. 12 non-AP, which is definitely pretty darn low. And their range is terrible, so 150 range. Now, granted, these guys do have expendable. They're very mobile. They do have stock, which is very, very nifty. But they have very low armor, terrible leadership. Right now, with their flank secure, they're sitting at 51. Their base is 45, which is god-awful. And yeah, they just really struggle. Personally, I think, and there's been some discussion on the forum as well about what the buffs. I think one of the best things to buff Ungor Raiders to make them a little more viable is give them an extra 15 or so range and an extra point of AP. This is granted a doubling of their AP damage, but it would make them a little more functional against medium armor units. It still means they're doing less AP per volley than a unit like High Elf Archers or Bretonnian Longbowmen or those are really the key units to compare them to, I guess. But it would make them a little more viable as a deterrent against enemy skirmishers. It would make them a little bit more viable at just doing a little bit more damage to medium armored units. Besides that, I don't really think the unit needs much. I just think those tweaks could make them a little more viable. I should note that a similar AP buff could also be utilized for the goblins, and I think that would make them a little more appealing without use of like rusty arrows. But especially for the Beastmen who don't have access to rusty arrows, the fact that their units have terrible AP stats, in my opinion, is hurting them very much. And the fact that the range is so bad makes it difficult. Against factions like High Elves, you have basically no counter to Legion Reavers besides hoping your Sigor hits them. Like a similar thing against Wood Elves, and it's very difficult to get into range. Even against Empire, they can kind of kite you with like grenade launchers, which is pretty insane. Next up, we're actually going to skip over the Vestigores real quick so we can cover the chaff. We do have the Ungor Spears. The only thing I really think these guys should get is Vanguard and maybe Stalk. It doesn't really make sense that normal Ungors, who you can see here, get both Stalk as well as Vanguard, and Ungor Spears and Ungor Spears with shields don't. It would open up some more options for Beastmen in their Vanguard builds. It gives you a little bit of sort of anti-large staying power, a little bit of blocking ability. And they are a little bit cheaper, so it lets you go with a little bit cheaper on your infantry line, get you a little more width on that Vanguard deployment. And I really don't think there's a serious balance reason for why Ungor Spears should not have at least Vanguard, if not Stalk. I think if you gave them both Vanguard and Stalk, they might need a plus 25 gold tweak upward, make them a little more pricey. But for sure, these units, they don't have particularly good stats. Their leadership is not good at all. It's a Bretonnian peasant tier. It's 54 leadership. They're squishy as all hell. Very bad melee stats. Only thing they really have going for them is their mobility, but you're forced to use them in these more defensive builds, and you can't really use them offensively, which I find is just annoying, and I think it really should be fixed. These guys really should, in my opinion, be given Vanguard, at least. If you want to argue that they don't deserve Stalk because you're worried they'll ambush cavalry, I'd say, well, look at friggin' nasty Skulkers who can ambush cavalry and slow it and kill it, but at least Vanguard would make them more useful, give you a little bit of cheap frontline anti-large support. Finally, Vestigores. And Vestigores are another unit that I don't think is necessarily, kind of like Minotaurs with shields, I don't think they're necessarily underpowered, but I think one of their big issues, and this is worse than the Minotaurs because you don't get Blood Greed, is their leadership, once again. Baseline of 66. As I mentioned before, keep in mind that Empire State Troops only have 60 leadership. And these guys only have 6 more. And you're in a faction that basically needs to get down and dirty in close quarters, and these guys just can't hold that well. Against factions that won't necessarily try to terror bomb you, or don't have that many tools for fear and terror, you can control it a bit with your own cavalry and your own monsters. It's not that much of an issue, but for the Beastmen, the fact that they have no real anchor unit is a huge problem. This Chaos Spawn, which as I mentioned, are going to get their own video, are not really a reliable source of anchor. Spearmen or Ungors in general are just too cheap, and they fall apart. Their leadership is terrible, and I don't necessarily mind that. I don't mind that as a part of the design. But the fact that Bestigors, who are the cream of the crop for the Beastmen, the elite of the elite, the fact that they really can't hold worth a damn and buy you any time is especially against like vampire counts, makes those matchups incredibly frustrating and difficult. And I think even if it came at the expense of like 25 gold or even 50 gold, maybe, I think that might be a bit much. I'd like to see their leadership bumped up to at least 70. I think that the unit could do with having 70 leadership, would make them a bit more viable as a holding tool, would give Beastmen a little bit of an anchor that they so desperately need. Really anything would do right now for them. The Beastmen just really struggle with that. And obviously you can argue that, yeah, if they had a Gorgon, they'd be better off, or if they had Jabberslythe, or if they had other units that they're missing from their roster, that they'd be better off. But the simple fact is that right now we're not getting those. And I think that as far as stat tweaks go, that's something I could fix or help the Bestigors. Or fix the faction, or help the faction. Not necessarily fix Bestigors. Bestigors are good for their cost. I want to make that clear, especially in matchups where you're not really dealing with that much fear and terror, because they're a hyper-mobile great weapon infantry. But when you need to deal with Vampire Counts, Coast, or Tomb Kings, and you really don't have a solid anchor, it really does prove a problem. Especially because Minotaurs are susceptible to cheap spears and cheap anti-large units. So you need something to back your Minotaurs up, even if you're using your Minotaurs as your main sort of bunker-busting force. And the fact that you don't have an infantry to do that is a problem. That said, that is it for my recommendations on what could and should be fixed, in my opinion, on the Beastmen. As usual, feel free to disagree, post your own thoughts, remarks, comments down below. I'll do my very best to respond as soon as I can, and I appreciate any input. I think it's good to sort of theory craft about these things, and always good to see what people think and what possible solutions, because oftentimes there's some really great solutions out there, great ideas for solutions out there for units that are just a bit underpowered or underperforming. As you guys might be wondering, there are some units here that you might think are necessarily a bit underpowered. For example, Baconators. I actually think Baconators are decent. They're actually kind of what Squigs should be, so that's why they didn't make the cut. So I think that for their price, they're solid enough. But yeah, besides that, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you found it entertaining, and hopefully give you guys some ideas, or hope you have your own input and thoughts and opinions to put down below. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.